Okay. Hi everybody, we finally made it. Thank you for being here and for taking part to this second panel. This morning panel was really amazing, lots of great ideas, and I'm sure many ideas will come up also here. So a short introduction on the Intelligent Instrument Lab that's organizing these two panels and inside the Nordic Days festival. That we're very thankful for this space. So this lab deals with, it's an ERC project. It's a 5 years long project that deals with artificial intelligence and in how artificial intelligence is changing our relationships with technology and with each other. And it does so by embedding AI in musical instruments, which might appear a bit weird at first, but when you think of it, musical instruments are at the edge of technology. They always have been at the edge of the technology of each era. And also, musical instruments are safe to experiment with AI. So it's a good way to kickstart research, and this is what we are doing at the University of the Arts. All this introduction also to invite you to come and explore and ask questions, bring your own projects, because in order to make our research, we need to relate with the musical environment, with performers, with composers that would bring ideas and projects to the lab. And so you can do this by searching us on Discord or on our social, but also you can come at the Friday meeting at the Open Lab. We have every Friday afternoon we have an Open Lab from 3 to 5, right? Where you can bring your projects or you can discover the project that we are working on too. And so yeah, please reach out, or you can also write us an email, and we're very happy to collaborate. So after all this introduction, it's time to start the contemporary Lutherie panel. So this morning, the whole discussion was about composition, and today it's going to be about the instrument, the object, the building, the relationship with the matter of the object, even though, as we kind of discovered, or probably we already felt, that the boundaries are blurred. So composition sometimes enter the instrument sometimes enter the composition, and this is a process that's being like rapidly kicking in musician practices, and this affects a lot Lutherie. And I guess, it's my guess, of course, that the changes in contemporary culture and society are affecting the building of the instrument themselves, because technology is way more available than before. It's cheaper, and we can all experiment with Internet of Things and with devices that can be bought quite easily and found quite easily. Maybe not in Iceland though, I don't know. And also, yeah, the building of this object is also connected, from my perspective at least, with the changes in that have happened lately. So there's less money to play gigs and have large groups, and so people, and many musicians, so people try to find their own voice. So this might be some possibilities, some ways of reading this great change that's happening in Lutherie. But to discuss about this, we have invited 4 luthiers. I don't know if you define yourself as such, but we will discover it in their own introduction. So I invite them to take 5 minutes each to present themselves, their practice, their work. Who wants to start? Halldór?
Sure. Okay, thanks, Nicola. And maybe I introduce you a little bit, because you neglected to do it. So I also work for the Intelligent Instruments Lab, and Nicola is actually doing a PhD in the lab. And so if you're interested in what we are doing, you will see more of him. Okay, my name is Halldór Úlfarsson, and I have that thing on the end there, the cello-looking string instrument, which I've modestly named the Halldórophone. And it started as a joke, because I am not a musician, and I thought it was a kind of ridiculous prospect that I could suggest a musical instrument to people. I studied as a visual artist, and I like to say that I was probably not a very good visual art student, but I was energetic, so I tried a lot of things. And when I started what eventually turned into that project, which is now, I would say, my career, I spent the majority of my time refining that and working on it and cajoling people to compose for it. And so the way I have come to that is not really through music, which is maybe what makes me a little bit unusual here today. So when I say it started as a joke, I hope that doesn't sound too cynical. I studied in Finland, in Helsinki, and my fellow students in that city were also from the Sibelius Academy, the Academy for Music there, the conservatory maybe for music there. And when I became friends with some composers, I noticed a kind of difference in how they felt a responsibility to what they were working on. They had a kind of overwhelming sense of weight, well, some of them did, to continuing the tradition of contemporary classical music making, let's say. And us at the Visual Arts Academy, we were maybe a little bit more flippant. One way to put it is that people were more interested in getting drunk and getting laid, while the composers were really having like nervous breakdowns while their short studies were being composed, you know, performed. So I became attracted to this seriousness, and out of it's you know, out of a kind of care, you know, which has later turned into a love, you know, I tried to shape this thing into something that they can use and maybe pushes them to work a little bit differently. This is, I'm making up history as I go. There's a lot of steps in between that don't sound this good. But now I find a lot of satisfaction in that I work on a project which I have a limited understanding of, because I am not a musician in a very real sense. I can't retain music, I can't really develop musical ideas. So through some weird kind of osmosis with my musical friends who give me information about how this is potentially more useful or interesting. Sometimes I resist because at a few junctures along the way, the Halldórophone could have become a crappy cello. And I think through resisting certain design choices, I've made it something that is difficult, but stimulating. And I enjoy the interaction very much around those lines. And my ambition for this project now, you know, which is a fantasy, but one that I like to entertain, I hope that it enters into our cultural commons. It has a Wikipedia, which I find fantastic. I hope that it enters into our cultural commons in some way, as, well, okay, maybe not as a guitar, but you know, like as a theremin or something, where like people feel ownership to it, they associate it with a certain kind of music making, and they will replicate it. And then it will automatically refine itself, almost in the sense of natural selection, where some features may become obvious and will, you know, survive passing through the creative hands of others, and others will just fade away because they don't make any sense. So I'm sure that sounds ambitious, and you know, more immediate ambitions is maybe getting 100 of these into the world before I die, and then maybe it has a fighting chance as a species of instruments. We'll see. Okay, that's probably it.
Ég heiti Áki Ásgeirsson. Ég ætla að tala á íslensku fyrst, á undan enskunni. Bara því mér finnst það mjög mikilvægt að hugsa á íslensku. Ég lærði list, tónlist, á ensku í Hollandi og það tók mér mörg ára að venjast í að geta hugsað á íslensku. My name is Áki Ásgeirsson. I will speak in Icelandic before speaking in English because Icelandic is a very small language which is in the last 5 years going very steeply downwards in terms of how people approach it, especially the younger generation. I would say 5-year-old kids are now bilingual, and the academia is very much English-based. It's an ancient language. 300,000 people in the world speak it, so I want to acknowledge this fact. I hope it will not bother you. I will try to be brief. Ég ætla að hafa þessa kynningu mjög stutta núna. Segur ég semst ekki með neitt ákveðið hljóðfæri hér. Ég ætla að lýsa fyrir ykkur nokkrum mismunandi hljóðfærum og ég semst lærði tónsmíðar, ég lærði raftónlist og hef svolítið þaðan farið í já, má segja mismunandi áttir sem tengjast kannski eitthvað sem var hægt að kalla miðlalist, þverfaglegri list og eiginlega svona gegnum það ferli komst að það eiginlega bara nokkurn veginn ein listgrein til. Það nokkra leiðir inn í gegnum skynfærin og inn í heilan en þau eru sem sagt en í rauninni búum við til listina inn í heilanum okkur, þannig að þetta markmið senda upplýsingar frá einum heila inn í aðra, að það krefst svona hvað á að segja fjölþættrar nálgunar. Þannig að ég ætla rauninni kannski ekkert að við getum rætt það meira á eftir en ég ætla svona að kynna fyrir ykkur nokkra mismunandi nálganir við infrastruktúrin í kringum að búa til tónlist og að skynja tónlist, að miðla tónlist og svona hvað hljóðfæri er, hvað það þýðir fyrir mér að búa til hljóðfæri. Já, förum í það betur eftir. So I'm an instrument builder, but also studied electronic music and composition, and I want to hear maybe afterwards, a little bit later in the talk, I want to introduce a few different ways that I see instruments or the potentiality of instruments and the usefulness of them, because in a way, well, I could name 3 categories in a sense. We have the category of shiny instruments, the instruments that are made from wood and they are varnished, or they are made from metal and they shine a little bit. They have been kind of like Halldór was saying, they have been worked on either by one person or in terms of like saxophone or dobrophone, other instruments named after their inventor, or by an anonymous group of people that over years or centuries have with a form of natural selection or organic design of experience made an instrument that we know today as being stereotypical or even fixed in terms of the piano. It's not very practical in a way to change the piano. Let's say we need one more octave, just one more octave, and then it's very difficult to do this. You know, it's a very small change, but very problematic. You need to build a new one yourself, or convince someone, or pay a lot of money, or whatever. And then you have one copy of a piano that has one more octave, and that will never. It's very unlikely that this will get into the mainstream of piano making. However, that's the kind of. We could also call this the classical instruments. You know, there's the symphonic instruments, etc. There's also the category of
instruments that are made for one specific piece, one purpose, they are often very unshiny. They often have like gaffer tape, they have sticky tape, lots of tape, and maybe no paint at all. They may be crappy, they may be found objects, but the thing is they don't need to be looking good because they have one purpose. They are not built to last necessarily, and they're not built to be replicated. So they are not prototypes of something else to be refined and processed, but they are final products which are suitable for their purpose. The third category could be an instrument category. I want to maybe point out one composer here, name drop, Guðmundur Steinn Gunnarsson, who has a piece later today. He invented for an orchestra. It's called golf, and they have never. Well, it's a secret orchestra. I don't think they have ever performed in public, but the idea was then to train the performer more than the instrument in a way, and the performer should be multidisciplinary instrument performers, and we can think about it a little bit in a sense of let's say today we have in the symphony orchestra, if we take that example again, we have people sitting on the violin benches where they have maybe held the same violin for many years. They have trained that type of instrument. But then in the back of a symphony orchestra you have the percussionists, and they learn a series of instruments. They might be better in one or the other, but they are percussionists. That means they play, a lot of instruments. So in this ensemble, the golf group, then there is then that principle is applied to string instruments and wind instruments. So you are unspecialized wind instrument performer playing a certain kind of, we could call it prototype instruments, but it's maybe easier to say like stereotypical or concept instruments, instruments of ideas. So I think you should. I think actually his piece today will be using traditional instruments, but please check out that concert later. All right. Maybe, I was going to keep this brief. Já, ég ætla að segja ykkur líka, mikið af því sem ég hef gert gegnum tíðina tengist samvinnu og svona ákveðnum leynisamtökum sem að heita Slátur og eru svona félag sem raun ekki endilega mikið að auglýsa starfsemi sína út á við, heldur rauninni tengist það kannski eins og einu þetta svið. Hljóðfæragerð Sláturs hefur ekki endilega verið til þess að búa til eitthvað sem, já eins og segi, eitthvað sem á að endast endilega lengi. Það eru, hljóðfærin eru oftar en ekki einmitt annarkvort eitthvað fyrir ákveðin verk eða eitthvað sem að getur þróast milli tónverka, einhvers konar eða jafnvel ímynduð hljóðfæri eða eitthvað sem bara búið til þegar á því þarf að halda en ekki endilega ekki til og ég held að það sé líka ákveðin tegund af menningu. Markmið þeirra samtaka að búa til tónmenningu en ekki endilega tónlist, og það þessi munur á list og menningu kemur mjög skýrt fram í þessu annars vegar að listamaðurinn upphafinn en menningin einhvers konar fjöldi og eitthvað sem það gerir áðins að hugsa það. So to end this introduction, I want to say that most of my work has been through a group called Slaughter, which is a secret organization that I will not tell you anything about. Esoteric knowledge.
Thank you, Áki. Although I'm very curious to know about this, maybe, yeah, I mean, when we will know each other better, maybe you're gonna tell me. Okay, thank you. Who you want to continue?
Yeah. Hi, my name is Úlfur. I am a composer and music producer, and I guess a big part of my connection to music is just from a very early age being transported by sound and being very curious about sound, and you know, all kinds of phenomena that doesn't necessarily have to be very complex or even musically like related to music, but just like acoustical phenomenon, like hearing your voice in a reverberant room, or you know, listening to how your spatial awareness changes moving from one space to another, going into a forest from a house or something like that. And even just like something beautiful, like, you know, this is just daylight being reflected off of water, but it's really beautiful. So just that kind of mystery about simple things that are all around us that have always kind of intrigued me. Also being a son of a violin maker, so many times witnessing as a child, you know, a silent object kind of, you know, quickening when you put the strings on for the first time. And there's like this Frankenstein moment where it's, you know, alive all of a sudden. And I think there's a lot of magic in that. Yeah, so I think that's what I'm interested in exploring and incorporating in my music. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Hello everyone, so I'm Mari Šišková, but I will also go by Mari Karik, which is my artist name. And I'm a sound designer, composer, and also singer. And I specialize in interaction design. I work with gestural controllers that can track my body movement that I can translate into sound control. And I'm really triggered by the way how we can work with movement itself, and how we can work with such an expressive tool and turn it actually into sonic applications. And yeah, so in this case, I think especially in this panel discussion, I will be mainly talking about my recent instrument that is called, for now, Blue Lantern. It's an instrument that has been created from discarded metal object that resembles lantern. I assume it probably was industrial lantern before, and I use it as a feedback instrument. I don't know, there is a photo, maybe on the website. Or I can show it later, maybe, like, you know, in between. Yeah. I will do it later, while, you know, somebody else is speaking. But yeah, so it's a metal object that I use as a feedback instrument, and really the beautiful part about it is that it's very rich in multiphonics and upper harmonics. This instrument has a lot of imperfection. It's an old material, and it has a lot of bumps. It has a lot of like corroded parts, you know. But those imperfections actually shape the sound. And in this kind of project or a piece, it's very much about this appreciation of the material and its imperfections. So every component that I actually use in this instrument shapes the sound. It's very much, it's very important what kind of microphones I use, what speakers I use, and I usually tend to go for old speakers because they have a lot of sonic artifacts left by the age of them. And yeah, so it's an instrument that I'm trying to mainly keep in its original form when it comes to the material, and kind of rather look at ways how it can be augmented and how we can look for new expressive ways of where can be found instruments. So yeah, hopefully I don't know, is that enough? Yeah, that's kind of a short introduction, but of course we'll probably dive deeper into it as we speak.
Yeah, thank you all for the great introductions and the many ideas that came out. Actually, the feeling is of very many different perspectives on instrument building. Like Halldór has kind of very formalized instrument in a way that has specific design constraints and a very clear shape. Aki, I had the feeling of like a framework, a philosophical framework for musical instruments that came out from your description, and I will be very curious to understand what's your position inside this. So maybe we can dig on this, and also the embodied perspective of your relationship with object lights and the feeling and your performativity, I would say, of the object. So there's an object that somehow is interacting and talking with you, in a way, communicating. So either of these perspective, I think, needs to confront, even for confirming or for negating or for proposing different ideas and perspective with tradition, like with instrument making and with these instruments like violins or pianos, for instance, that kind of at a certain point in history find their own final shape, let's say, or kind of crystallized in a shape that for a while has been the norm, and this allowed also them to get diffused and get performed and learned, and for languages, compositional language, to get developed on top of them. So my question, maybe it's a bit vague, but is how do you confront tradition? How do you incorporate, or how do you relate with it? Who wants to start?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Like, how does an instrument catch on? How does it become something that's relevant within a culture that maybe has existed for hundreds or even thousands of years? And I think it's interesting looking at Western music, where, for example, we talked about the orchestra earlier, where you have all these incredible instruments, and each one of those instruments has possibilities that are rarely even touched on or explored in the Western classical canon, because most of the composers sit in front of a piano when they're composing the music. So it's kind of like you're playing with a modern contact sample library or something, where each key corresponds to a note on an instrument, rather than, wow, what you can do with a clarinet with multiphonics or circular breathing, or even going beyond the tempered scale of the piano is something that is difficult to do if you compose everything from the mindset of a composer sitting in front of a piano. So I don't know, I feel like if there's a new instrument, it needs people to kind of sit down with it and get to know it and kind of figure out what they want to draw out of it and what's possible, and kind of fearlessly go into exploring what is easy to play, or what's interesting or what's compelling. And sometimes even if it's a very expensive object, then it's very exclusive. So I think that also brings a lot of weight of you need to make it work for the situation where it's presented in, maybe in a classical context or a new musical context. So it has to be like very atonal or strange or not pleasing or more cranial, more intellectual. So what I find is most compelling is maybe, like Áki was touching on, the DIY aspect, or marginalized people who have maybe not as much access to crazy expensive big technological monsters, but rather something that you have to put together yourself and figure out yourself, and through that practice you make this deep connection to it that otherwise would not arise from simply walking into a store and buying a weird noise maker or something like that. So I think maybe, out of need, you create new cultures or trends, or you know, there's a vibe in that, for sure.
And Áki, what do you think, like, in your description of the, like, this framework, what would be very interesting to understand is where you sit, where's your practice specifically? How do you enter this framework, and how do you realize your instruments?
Já, ef spurningi var í sambandi við hefðir í tónlist, hefðbundin hljóðfæri, þá eru margir kostir við þau. Þau eru til, þau eru út allt, og hérna, það er hægt að náttúrulega nýta, þeir sem eru skapandi nýta náttúrulega hluti í umhverfinu. To switch to English, I think one thing when making an instrument is one feeling is joy. You know, if you are excited about new sounds, then you're happy with exploring that instrument, and that's also again my criticism of the hyper established traditional instruments. They have less joy. Sömuleiðis getur maður spáð í menningu og hvaðan við komum, hver hefðin okkar að við erum ekkert endilega svo vestræn, held ég, hérna út á þessu svæði sem við erum á og búum á, en heldur hefur vestræna menningin verið send til okkar, hún hefur svona rekið upp á fjörurnar okkar, eða þá verið tróðið onni eyrun á okkur, eins og þið munið þegar að, þið munið ekki kannski þegar að hvað heitir þetta aftur, gömlu sálmannir og nýju sálmannir, munið þetta því, og það var cirka svona helmingur af kirkjugestum sem að bara hættu að syngja, af því að fyrir þann tíma þá var kirkjutónlistin miklu nær því að vera eins og rimnakveðskapur þar að segja að fólk söng, það var það sem heitir forsöngvari, og forsöngarinn var ekki sá sem að söng háværast, heldur hann var þá sem söng fyrst, af því það voru engar sálmabækur, þannig að hver söng á sínum hraða og svona ákveður mörgum sekundum á eftir forsöngarinn, þannig að þá var ákveðin menning drepin mjög hratt. Líka var ég til í að I also want to maybe, sorry, I'm drifting a little bit, but I can say, for example, in terms of culture, and where, because it fits, it has to do with instruments and where we are going, because instruments, they are made for certain culture, certain context, certain infrastructure, as was discussed in the morning panel here, when Þórhallur was talking about this route from a composer, which in the 19th and 20th century also was this kind of almost kind of godly creator in a way, the idea of a genius artist, which then in solitude, sometimes a little bit miserable solitude, composes a piece of glorious art, which is then transformed through the medium of a score, for example, or written instructions to the performers, and then the link is the literacy of how to interpret this information. If there is not the need for this distribution, which both has happened in the 20th century with recording techniques, and there is the need for scores to send out music to remote areas, and that need is greatly diminished with the inventions of radio, for example. And with the internet today, then we also have basically a breakdown of this infrastructure of that culture. In terms of Iceland and Icelandic instruments, I sometimes think of, I read a small news article 15 years ago or something, when country bær. Do you remember Halldór Úlfarsson? He had this kind of country music radio station in north of Iceland, in a very remote area. There was just like a few farms, cows, and then this guy that was hugely interested in country western music, and he started his own radio station and was kind of spreading the gospel of country, and the thing he never really got much support from Iceland, but then the American embassy gave him a special cultural awards, which is fine, but I think a lot of people in remote areas like Iceland have been overwhelmed in a sense with foreign culture, with globalization, with the idea of being Western, of being civilized, that we have not really looked at our own culture. And most people today in Iceland, if you ask like, what are the instruments, we don't really have so many instruments. We have symphonic instruments. Yeah, I know. We have a few, but they are, like I say, new. So it's in a way a very good time, and it's in many ways good to be a part of a new country without much tradition. But I think there is actually tradition, but it has been broken up. Já, ég ætla ekki að segja mér í byrju. Yeah, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.
I don't know if it answered the question.
I think so. I think so. And anyways, it was super interesting. So, Halldór, well, your instrument is a cello in a way, or I could tell from outside that it feels like a cello. So is it? Is it or isn't it? How does it relate with the original shape of the instrument?
Okay, I'll try to tap into your question and then maybe tag on to what I think Áki is trying to express. No, of course you're right. It's copying features from an instrument that is studied by a huge number of humans across the globe. And that's intentional. It also visually cozies up to a very powerful cultural institution here in the West. And that's intentional.
We are not in the West. Sorry, continue.
So there are some strategic lines of thought into designing around what has essentially been waiting to be given space in instrument making since we had pickups and amplifiers. Feedback is, it feels almost natural. And I've spent a lot of thought in conversation with colleagues to try to think of natural processes or situations where you have this very familiar sense that a feedbacking system will give you. And it's hard to think of such a situation in the immediate sense that these two instruments, for example, give you access to. But maybe it's easy to think about a localized ecosystem over a little bit more time, where you have a complex system and you can have things spin out of control, or one microbe takes up more space than it should for the health of the system, so to speak. So in that sense, feedback is maybe not very immediately available to us, except perhaps in communication, and perhaps in communication with animals of burden like horses or donkeys or something, where you have to negotiate with something with its own will, but you're kind of driving it, So all of which to say is that from a stupid non-musical point of view, I liked this feeling of a stream of information that I could shape, which is very good for a non-musician because sound is happening and then you just kind of wriggle around. You don't have to have a musical thought to get started. It's there already and then you can shape it. But there's a lot of culture in that packaging. And some of it is practical, some of it is what I thought was appropriate. I think a bowed instrument is a good reference for a droney or self-resonating instrument because it's in a similar sound world, and then there is a set of sympathetic strings there that function as a kind of bourdon string or drone strings that you can let resonate with whatever you're articulating on the fingerboard. I'm not as dystopian about the fact that we are being contaminated by culture that comes from across the sea on this little island that we have here. I think we are reversing the flow, so now we are starting to push our culture on the Western world, which I think is fine. But to be honest, I don't think about it very much. I had this mind that when you have something new and you think about how it may play out in the world, perhaps the ratio of new to familiar should be 1 to 9. Something like that. Then you have a cultural organism that perhaps has a fighting chance. And I enjoy that. I enjoy a bigger conversation where people are invited to participate in something that is maybe a little bit intimidating on the premises that they're used to, but gives them enough familiar language, because ultimately this is language. The piano is a language. It gives you vocabulary to express certain things at the same time excluding other things, which I think is true for most of our kind of designed objects and probably specifically instruments. So I think I embrace that, you know, we have these trends which are very large in now our shared kind of global culture, and we can lean into interfaces or parts of interfaces or organizations of these sounding elements that people have an idea about, and then I think we can play with it a little bit. And if we find a healthy mix of familiar and unfamiliar, we can make good of the kind of skill sets that exist and maybe have an enjoyable conversation that has a slightly different premise.
Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. Before, like, maybe asking to yourself if you have questions and to open the discussion, I was thinking of a final question that it's kind of related with what you just said. So it has to do with the instrument entering the culture. And my question is, if even all of you really want this to happen. I mean, I'm seeing very unique instruments, sometimes like one of a kind, or sometimes in your case, they're irreproducible. So that might be a problem unless you're fine with that. So yeah, my question is, how does the uniqueness of an instrument relate with the need of, or the perspective of making it a part of a culture? So, like writing a book, your ideas get diffused through your instrument.
Well, to be honest, I kind of don't want to make it reproducible, because, you know, in this case of this instrument, it is very much about the age of the instrument and the imperfections, and you can't reproduce that. You can't just, I mean, of course, I could build a box in the same dimensions, I could put on, you know, kind of almost the same speakers if I could find, you know, maybe speakers that kind of work in a similar, like, are kind of similar to the ones that I've been using before. But then the kind of whole purpose of appreciating found material is gone. And I think what I would rather think about in future for kind of looking for ways how this system can become a part of a culture is more about creating a portable feedback system. So, because in this case, the microphones that I'm using, they are not used as a static element, that are there just to reproduce the sounds in the most realistic way. Rather, their role is through the movement and for kind of changing the position of the microphone on the surface, it triggers different harmonics, you know. So if I think in future how I want this to become maybe a more kind of widespread tool, I would actually think about kind of creating a box that would be running probably on Bella, which is something that we can maybe discuss later. Maybe the Intelligent Instrument Lab, but yeah, to kind of rather have think about the kind of feedback machine that can be put on any found objects, because also when it comes to the culture element, there is not really a direct association to previous instrument. Of course, feedback has been here for many years, and it's becoming very dominant kind of part of the instrumental design. But yeah, for me, I'm kind of more interested in how I can recontextualize objects that have different cultural background. So for instance, the lantern, it hasn't been used for a musical purpose before, but I can also take maybe, I don't know, the box over there and turn it into an instrument, you know. It's more about kind of how the pieces of equipment that we use in our daily life, how they can become musical instruments, how we can give them a new role, you know, and kind of explore what is hidden inside of their own material. And you know, of course, every tool is going to sound different because it has different past. It has gone through different modifications. So yeah, I kind of like the uniqueness of the singular object that I'm using, and yeah, I would kind of like to keep it this way, you know. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because also like kind of, if I can get back a little bit to the lantern, what I kind of really like about the instrument, I spend a lot of time behind computer, like designing my digital instruments for the digital controllers, and I really needed a space away from it. I needed something that is about tactility, that is about haptic feedback, which I get, you know, directly from the material, from touching the material. There is something that creates a strong sense of presence when I interact with it, that is communicative. Because, you know, like the digital musical instruments that I design, they do what I tell them to do, you know. But with this one, you never exactly really know. Like, you can determine the communication, you can lead the communication in the play by, let's say, if I augment, like if I sing through the lantern, which I use it often for vocal augmentation, and I can determine the resonance pitch. And also by placing the speaker or like the microphone in a certain position, I can determine the resonance, but I can't completely predict exact reaction, you know. So it is often like it's full of surprises, you know, and this kind of sense of presence that is gonna be different, or like this kind of sense of their own voice of the material is gonna be different for each material, and that's what I like, and that's why I want to keep it that way, you know. So, but yeah, if you have more questions about it, I hope it makes sense, like, you know, this kind of background, how I got into it, and yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And how do you feel about your art? Is one of a kind? Is it something that you would like to scale? You imagine scale? It will be anyways one of a kind. How do you relate with that?
I kind of like the idea of things coming into existence that don't make commercial sense and still having value, you know? So I think that's kind of nice. Yeah. And it doesn't make any sense in that respect at all. Like, absolutely not.
Yeah.
And it would be a nightmare. And just a totally different thing. I think I'm more interested in kind of, you know, this, like you were talking about the tactile thing with electronic music. It's like an age-old dilemma of like how disembodied like electrical signals can be in a musical form. But I feel also there's something that happens when you have an object that is kind of responding to your will, but also in a slightly unpredictable way, which goes for any object that is an instrument that you can touch. And you know, it can be a piano or a guitar or a weird instrument that's new. But there's something that happens that kind of almost makes it more than the sum of its parts, that I feel is kind of interesting, that it almost has like this mystical quality to it, like it has there's a presence or something. You know, like how you can have a guitar for 20 years and then you play another guitar at your friend's house and there's a different song in that one than you could have found in the other one. And why is that? Why do you relate to this guitar in a different way to the, because it smells differently, it feels different in your hands. it's laid out a little bit differently. And also, like, some objects have this kind of strange symbolism to them. Like, I think Dóri's symbolism is very strong. It has a very, like, deep effect on our subconscious, you know, idea about what music is and what it looks like. You know, what music looks like, which is, you know, really beautiful. Like, if a child would draw a picture of a musical instrument, it would have like a certain form, and I think we're all kind of familiar with those forms, even though they're not always exactly the same. But for my instrument, I was interested in something that kind of has this gravity of like a presence or something that is mysterious, and you need to interact with it to kind of get to know what's happening. So like the technical aspect is not so interesting to me, you know, in a more personal, nerdy kind of way it is, but not like what I wanted this object to be. It's more like the monolith in 2001, you know, just something that you really want to touch and know more about. That I think is, you know, inspiring for music making, which is what it's in the end all about.
Yeah, very interesting, thank you. I would like to open the conversation if anybody has questions and like perspectives to suggest. I have some other questions, but maybe. Yeah.
I just wondered. Thank you, everybody, for your insights. I just wondered. Some of the things you're talking about seem to be to do with the ideas of instrumental agency, the instrument object, or however you want to see that, has a certain kind of life of its own, that it will do certain things or respond in a certain way, or that it has a kind of embedded history or life or something that kind of unfolds, even if it's something that sits there in a cupboard for 20 years and then you get it out and you sort of dust it off and think, oh, yeah, that's kind of part of the object's life, or something. It acquired something new in the layers of dust or something, you know. Talking about the smell of a guitar or something, you know, it's like those things that you can't really replicate in any way, but it has a unique agency about it that influences the kind of way it catalyzes musical endeavors and behaviors when we pick it up and want to play it. And then that relates as well to the idea of affordance, that there are affordances like the hammer has a handle, so we naturally kind of see that and want to pick it up, and instruments have a sort of natural affordance as strings, so what do we want to do? We want to pluck them, or if there's a bow, we want to bow them and see what happens. So this kind of tendency to do certain things with certain objects just because we recognize patterns of behaviors and patterns of physicality. Is that, I mean, there's not really a question. I suppose the question is sort of, do you recognize that as part of your thinking when you're designing or modifying or working with your instrument?
It was a very interesting question. Actually, what I was noting before is that most of these instruments are feedback instruments, and that has a lot to do with agency, with like outsourcing part of the music generation to something else that's other than you, and to relate with in a way. So yeah, to build, like you talked about a golem yesterday, so the idea of building something that is not you and relate with it. Yeah, absolutely. How do you feel about the agency of the instrument?
I mean, maybe it's also kind of a postmodern thing of the participant, you know, being part of the thing. But yeah, I think that like the projection you have of the instrument that you are about to interact with has a deep effect on what comes out of it. Like, you know, I think holding a violin is very different the moment you're told that it's a Stradivarius. And you know, there's also like this in the digital age, like this fetishism for authenticity, like, oh, it's analog, completely analog, or like, you know, I know this other violin maker who's a friend of my father's who collects dust from attics, like, you know, up in the attic. He scrapes it off the floor and puts them inside the instrument that he's making to make it feel more old, as if it's more valid because it's like ancient. Or so there's also this kind of fear of losing meaning, I think, in everything being copyable or kind of you know, its soul being sucked out of it by being sampled or captured by a digital system that's dead inside. And yeah, I don't know. So I think that's definitely very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, also the work we're doing at the lab somehow relates with this, because if there's agency that's being embedded in instruments through their physicality and through feedback and through a physical phenomenon, what we're kind of trying to do is like have something else algorithmic that's gonna generate part of the musical outcome and then interact with it. Yeah, so there's like this little thread that kind of connects this instrument building with the digital AI embedding.
Can I add one more thing?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that yes, people want instruments to be either imperfect or analog or old or have agency to interact with, but only, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like there's this limit you hit where the agency of the instrument is too great, where it starts to kind of threaten authorship and your ego as a creator or genius, like Áki was talking about, which is also interesting.
Yeah. Can I add to this? I think it's an interesting discussion. It's a slippery slope when you go into agency. It probably exists on a gradient that reaches quite far in both directions, and you have to kind of hone in on a little bit of what you mean. I think a lot about like the classical tradition when I consider this subject, and I have gotten more, I think, adept at transferring ideas or reflections of ideas into the design of that thing that derive from classical culture. And one thing that occurs to me is that if somebody chooses a career as a classical player, they may wind up spending equal or more amount of time with their instrument than they will a spouse. It's equivalent to a marriage, whether that's a cello or a clarinet or whatever. And then I think agency may come from character, certain mechanical responses that the player becomes familiar with and knows to be their instrument. I think from what you said, you probably meant these vibrotactile electromechanical instruments that push back perhaps a little bit more, perhaps have a kind of dominant dynamic that the player has to contend with. That's what I think about, at least. But it's a slippery slope with agency. I think synth players are super comfortable with, you know, they create some sort of ghost in their machines that can change from one day to the next, and the patches are all different, and they kind of are comfortable with these systems that they build on the fly and exist within for a musical moment and then disappear and they can never recreate. I had a thought, but it slipped away from me. It was better than that rambling.
Agency.
No agency.
Can I add, maybe, I mean, you say synth players, maybe they don't spend as much time with one particular synth as a violin player would do with his or her violin. And I think actually maybe synthesizer players are more in this category I was mentioning before with percussionists having being multi-instrumentalists by default, and also synthesizers are not in a way complete instruments. If we would split, if we would say, oh, look at, okay, if I, in my mind, would say, what is an instrument? It has a few components, let's say 4 components, one being the interface, that's what you see and what you touch. Number 2 is the sound generator, it's the stuff that vibrates on the instrument. Number 3 is the resonating body. So maybe it's just 4. No, sorry, maybe it's just 3. It's 3 components. So because the resonator can also be the amplifier, or the internet, or loudspeakers here or there. So a synthesizer is a detached instrument. It does not have necessarily an interface. It can include an interface, but it does not have amplification. You need an external amplifier. Same with the difference between an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar. You need an amplifier, which automatically becomes a part of the instrument. And this is I think this influences maybe what you were asking, the feeling of warmth and familiarity or agency of an instrument. The feeling of holding it. I think it's very different for mass-produced instruments, found objects, instruments that are a multiple of something. And I don't know, in my my practice, I've also quite often deliberately detached instruments. I made one instrument, for example, called Sleglaspil, which is a set of automatic beaters. So you can control the beaters, you can play the beaters, but they don't have any sounds. You know, it depends on what you are beating. The same as with percussion, you have a beater and then you have the drum. But if you can automatically move the beaters with a computer, then it creates something which is different, and then it could be called an instrument. The same also, and it's very interesting when a person is holding, for example, an automatic beater, then you enter the area of the cyborg, and the same with muscle control. Then you have a person which is performing involuntarily, and then it opens up all kinds of questions in terms of, for example, the score, the information from the composer, who's in charge also, and also the professionality and professionalism in a way, and the need for, and basically the need, like we have been discussing, you know, like people who spend decades perfecting their skills on a specific instrument versus someone in terms of a cyborg muscle-controlled instrument. Then you basically just need someone that has a body, and then someone that can relax and do nothing, which is a lot of people. You know, not everyone, but you know, normally you can have someone just to be there, and then if the composer, computer, or whatever brain is delivering the message, if they can move this person, but yeah, and then also the question arises, why to have a body there at all? Well, that's another discussion maybe.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Actually, yeah.
So kind of coming from the things you talked about so far, all of your instruments are in some way electrical, as far as I can tell from home pages and the instruments here, and a lot of them also digital, and that seems to be something that holds true for most of the new instruments that are being developed, especially by people who are developing them on their own. Is that something you think about, or is that maybe even something you think is problematic, because it always implies some sort of dependency on the availability of electricity in a room or at the place where you want to play, or in terms of digital instruments, it means that there have to be digital chips available. We're already in a shortage of those. So how does that influence your practice?
If I may answer just quickly, there's also, I mean, pianos are made from ivory and ebony and all kinds of materials that are very rare. People have like the industry of piano building has found other materials for it to make up for exploitation of certain animals and plants. Same with violence and we are not using guts and hair anymore. Well, we are using hair.
Horses.
Yeah, horses. I don't know. And in terms of sustainability, I'm actually very interested in making like purely acoustic instruments also. But I think we as a species, we are not sustainable. We are not environmentally friendly. However, I mean, we can try to be a little bit more, and but then it's just it's an ongoing thought. What you do, how does it influence others, and the nature around you. Again, but then the other side is just it's fun to play around with whatever's there, and it's nice to play whatever traditional instruments. Use whatever material you have. I don't know.
Just to tack on to that, I think it's a common fallacy to try to separate humans from technology, and the fact that we don't have very much hair left these days, and our claws are not good for killing, and our teeth are not good for ripping apart prey, is a consequence of our technological nature. Áki may eat an occasional seal, but I don't. So I think if we accept that we're inherently technological, then we tend to absorb into our practices, whatever they may be, the available technologies of the time. So then there's a bunch of other considerations. What's in your immediate environment, what's in your skill set. And I can speak for the Halldór. There's a block diagram of what makes sense in terms of the electronics of the Halldór. I have some overview over maybe half of that system, but the actual circuit design I'm not competent at. I know what I wanted to do, but then I have to collaborate with somebody who does that for me, or in collaboration with me using their skill set. That instrument is made from predominantly mulberry, which is from a tree felled in Greece. It has some other species of wood in it, but that's kind of the main species of wood. I'm now making an instrument this winter, which is from a tree felled in Reykjavik. It's not super intentional. It's just where I am and what's at hand and who I'm working with and the kind of circumstances of my life. And I think this is kind of a fundamental conditions for most creative humans, whatever they're doing. Globalization has an effect, shipping, flying, all that stuff, but yeah, I think we tend to play with what's available.
I also just think it's maybe important not to be too concerned with the apocalypse when you're being, creative. In any sense, like whatever you're doing, if it's an album or a piece of visual art or an instrument, like everything will turn to dust eventually anyway. So I think the immediacy of whatever is in your environment and what you are creating and the experience of being part of that with your fellow humans is equally important.
And I think also living in Iceland is actually quite a good lesson that you don't have everything accessible as soon as maybe as you would like to. So my project originally was supposed to go a very different way, but I decided that I would need to wait 1 month to actually have the components delivered here. So that's why it shifted more towards this idea of, okay, how I can actually build the instrument mainly from discarded materials, how I can actually repair broken speakers, how I can actually use something that, we kind of we are in a way spoiled that, you know, once something doesn't work, like we throw it away straight away. But this idea that, you know, rather like instead of throwing away something that still could work, I will rather look at ways how I can still reuse some of the materials and apply them directly to my piece. Of course, the consequence is that it's not gonna maybe perfectly replicate the sound as I want to, but I kind of started to use it actually as a crucial element of it, that, you know, the imperfection is again part of the instrument. And yeah, so it kind of also taught me that I just maybe shouldn't just buy new piece of equipment or even new piece of software as soon as it is released, you know, but rather look for ways or like tools that we have around us and try to be more considerate. Of course, I'm still guilty of buying new software, you know, when it comes out, and I find it very difficult to actually resist. But at least when it comes to hardware, I'm trying to now rather look into my environment, like what I can reuse, maybe even from my older instruments. If I don't use them anymore, okay, let's just take it apart, you know, and use the parts that I can actually use for the new one. And yeah, so I think in a way the limitations of inaccessible markets is actually can be a good opportunity for us to be more present and yeah, to just be way more aware of our environment, but not just ecologically, but environment literally, like the space we are in. Yeah.
Any other question? Well, maybe I'm going with a question. Well, I have many, but there's one that's been like pressing in my mind for a while, and it's because, well, I didn't introduce myself actually, but I consider myself a composer, so my background is partially in jazz music, so you compose and perform at the same time, very often, and partially in electronic music. And so what I'm wondering, and it's how to connect this morning's panel with the one of today, and how composition enters your instruments. So how do you manage to distinguish, if you distinguish between the two? I mean, I know for myself it's a process of time, so it doesn't relate much with the object in itself, but like with the ability to perceive something that was thought before in the performing act. But yeah, I'm wondering how you feel about this.
Yeah, I think interestingly, electronic music in particular has always kind of inherently made composers who are interested in it create their own instruments. Like early electronic Icelandic music was, you know, Magnús Blöndal, who was working at the national radio, and he was making music with sine wave generators and, you know, tape machines, and, you know, they're not really musical instruments, but he would set them up in a way that would allow him to create his compositions. And, you know, the same thing you see today with guitar pedals laid out where you make an extension of your guitar, or like modular synthesizers, like an obvious, you know, kind of example of how, if you're involved in electronic music, you are always pairing things together like functional blocks to create an environment that creates sound. And I think in my case, that's also kind of why I wanted to create this instrument, was just curiosity about what would happen if these particular functional blocks would come together and create like this one object that I could interact with. But then, funnily enough, I have never actually used this instrument in my own compositions, because I later realized that when I'm exhausted from composing, there's this more analytical kind of technical part of my brain that takes over, and I can rest the two kind of flip-flopping in between.
Okay, there's a switch.
Yeah.
Interesting. Actually, what about you?
Yeah, I think some instruments are just, or actually maybe all instruments have an optimal melody for them, and some it's much more obvious than others. Some even have a sequence of pitches or rhythms or sounds. That is just the ideal way to play that instrument. I think of the airwaves tubes. You remember them? They are instruments that that just give a very certain sound, like very long tubes that me and two other people created together, and then the music composition was just the instrument itself, and then we performed on the instrument for a certain amount of time, recorded this, and then threw away the tubes. So basically, yeah, I think it just depends on kind of what I said before with this. That's the way I see it, at least, with the different types of instruments. Some are multiples, some are pieces, and some are shiny objects that are used again and again. So that if it's just made from historic reasons or practical reasons to repeat a melody on an instrument. But I think for me personally this is less interesting.
Can I give my perspective? So I generally have interacted with two kinds of musicians around the work with Halldór Úlfarsson. One is this kind of very open-minded, open doors, experimental, often improvised electroacoustic stuff where people bring whatever the gear they have and improvise together. And then, as it turned out, a lot of classically trained people who then perhaps have their identity in new music. And it's this latter group that I thought about speaking about in this context, that so their background is this very rigorous training in the often Western classical kind of canon, where they the task is to embody a piece of music, to feel it and understand it, and then interpret it, which is their then kind of skill set or their contribution. And then if you have this way of music making in what we can call contemporary classical music or new music, often the musicality is a little bit abstract. It's potentially more conceptual. It's a little bit, I'm going to say less musical, but that may be wrong. But what I observed as a tourist in this scene, because I am a tourist in music, regardless of everything, is almost like an anthropological observation of this, when extremely gifted musicians have this problem, which they seem to enjoy because they voluntarily go to it again and again, to understand or feel a new musicality. And I think I took a cue from this when then, I started to play this game that I do with this instrument to like commission new music or see if somebody is interested or offer it up or something like that. And then I've had this privilege of seeing extremely competent, well-trained musicians negotiate a difficult musical interface because it pushes back. It has its own internal dynamics that tend to override maybe a particular note or harmony you want to create, or delay you in time, or the note emerges too early or something like that. And then I see something which I enjoy very much, which is that they, because I can't do it, they are creating a new sense of musicality around this way of playing. So I think what I truly appreciate is the attention, and I think this goes for any kind of artist, but we happen to be talking about music today, is that when people they start by refining a skill set, which is usually some combination of technical and aesthetic, and they give it their time and attention, and then when they have that, they may choose to use it in a, let's say, conservative way, as it has been prescribed before, or they may veer a little bit off track and start to form a new approach to what they do. And I think it's this kind of slice, this intersection of rigorous training and attention to being open-minded to new practices that I particularly enjoy. And I've been fortunate enough to bring this project to a point where it can become like a conversation piece around something like that.
Wow. What you were saying kind of, yeah, made me think of, well, made me, because I lost the idea, but it's about the how you would like imagine and evaluate your instrument with the participation, with participative practices. For instance, yesterday we were trying your harp, and at that time we were like 2-3 people interacting somehow, and at the same time it seems that, well, it's a fact that the more people interact with the system, the more you get new weird ideas on how to implement it or evolve it. So how do you relate it with that? Like, did you find ways to evaluate your instrument through participation with other people, or is it just a personal process where you evolve it based on your impression and ideas and feelings?
I think with the lantern, I was actually quite surprised when other people started to play it, because, you know, it's not really an instrument that triggers any previous associations with playing techniques, you know. It kind of also can be intimidating because you don't know how to play it. You never played something like this instrument, probably, and that kind of, if the person can actually still feel inspired to actually start to play it, even though they don't really know how, I think that was for me kind of the first really important thing to notice, you know, that if, like, when it was actually played through other people. And the more they played it, the more they kind of started going crazy around it, you know, with like introducing techniques. I was like, oh, this is really cool. So I kind of don't really have a prescribed methods how to play the instrument. I mean, there are kind of, I would say, appearing patterns that I see that they're working really well with the instrument. They complement the material. But there is also a lot of open space, actually, for the participants to create their own techniques. And also because the interface is in a way trying to stay very simplistic, that also, I think, takes away a little bit of the intimidating feeling when they approach the instrument, you know, because it's trying to be the least technical as possible. I mean, there are very few control knobs, you know, for you to play with, and hopefully in future there will be even kind of less simplified version, because I want the interaction to be very intuitive. That can kind of rather be about ways how they can introduce new ways to play the material. I really like to call it material rather than instrument, because it is, you know, kind of rather augmentation of found materials. You know. So, yeah. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I just started thinking about like the classical Western tradition, which like weighs so heavy on most of us, and about you know, this you talk about intimidation, and I think that's a very powerful word when it comes to something beautiful like music. Like, how can anything be intimidating when it comes to music? Why are we sweaty in our palms before playing music together? It's like a ridiculous situation, even for kids, you know, being intimidated by playing together. And you know, I don't want to get like political or conspiracy theorist or anything, but I think maybe it's a colonial tradition. It is like, you know, about dominating something that pushes back. You are aiming to perfect something that is impossible to do, like overcoming the limitations of what your flesh and bone can do to a wooden stringed object like a cello. And maybe feedback instruments, it's interesting how they are almost all feedback based, because it's not only that they push back or have agency, it's also that it's a little bit like controlling the wind. You know, it's chaotic within bounds. It's very interesting. It's like an Aeolian harp or something like that. But it relieves you of the idea that you will ever be able to directly control it with your mind, with your cranial, you know, facilities, and rather approach it by feel or the moment, which is possibly a way to get out of the, you know, really heavy, dominating feel, intimidating feeling of, you know, taking something like that's written on a page and translating it perfectly like a machine with your fingers.
Total control is unlikely.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially with this. Yeah.
So, is there any other question? Maybe we should start to wrap up, but I have a few others. Well, one that I'm thinking is, I mean, we've been talking about music making, performance, sound, but they are also beautiful objects. I mean, these instruments are beautiful objects, or they can, anyways, they have a very strong physicality, or in your case, they could be objects of ideas, or they have a very limited temporality. So, what's the value of the aesthetic of the instrument in your own instrument building? Áki, maybe?
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat?
Yeah, definitely. What's the value of aesthetics? Because I asked you, like, it's a question for everybody, but I'm very curious about how you place that into temporary or idea instruments.
Yeah, you mean the aesthetics of, like, as an appearance, or in the sound?
In appearance.
Yeah, there's no value in aesthetics.
I knew you would say
that. No, instruments, in my opinion, it's just me, it should be functional and created for a purpose, and they should be fun. Mér finnst sko gleðin við að smíða hljóðfæri, sérstaklega því að það er hljóðfæri að smíða umræður, ætti að vera alveg í toppinum, sko, númer 1, 2 og 3, og mér langar að vitna í, sko, í Davíð Brynjar sem sagði í morgun að það að skrifa raddskrá fyrir flytjendur sem að verða að spila eins og það sem skrifað, það væri ofbeldi, og í rauninni, sko, ákveðin svona sviputegund af ofbeldi eins og þegar fólk á að gera það sem þið sagt að gera þegar það í vinnunni, annars missir það launin sín og getur ekki borgað leiguna og svona, þannig að þá fer gleðin mjög fljótlega úr samhenginu, eins og maður sér stundum. Ég veit ekki hvort ég hafi verið í baksviðs hjá Sinfóníuhljómsveit Íslands, það talar enginn tónlist, það er regla, það má ekki tala tónlist í kaffitímum hjá Sinfó, af því það allir konur með upp í kók af sérstaklega verkunum sem verið að spila. En allan það er annað. So I'm talking about the enjoyment of creating an instrument, of performing. It should be interesting, and for me also, like in terms of creation, I'm still puzzling a little bit with this ratio that Halldór mentioned, 9 against 1, in terms of innovation should be 1 part, and 9 of them should be tradition. I don't think so. I think it's the most fun language that you can speak is a language that you make on your own. The downside is that nobody else will understand you, but this does not make it less fun. So we can also make, let's say, 2 out of 9 or 3 out of 9 or 8 out of 9, just our own feelings, our own practice, our own crazy ideas, and then maybe just like 1 out of 9 people will get what you're doing. I think that's also fine. Just as a, yeah.
To touch on the aesthetics, I agree that it definitely shouldn't be, in my opinion, it shouldn't be the focus when it comes to instrumental design. That's kind of the last thing. But it is important, in my opinion, because it defines the interaction with the other participants. If it's not an instrument that it's going to be played only by ourselves, but we actually want to introduce it to other people, the aesthetics can actually very easily either discourage or actually welcome the participants to become a part of the instrument. And aesthetics, in my opinion, is not just a matter of beauty, but it's also a matter of the visual design, that kind of like how kind of the aesthetic can be intuitive. And it's more about kind of the design, how they will afterwards perceive it. So in this case, I think aesthetics can actually really elevate the instrument and even introduce new playing techniques. So even though it's something that is kind of very minor, it can really affect the playability and the interaction. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. It really touches in interaction design and like interface building and projecting. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would argue that it is the most important factor. I think beauty is not necessarily vain. I think it's a point of connection, and definitely you could argue that what an instrument actually is the interface, and whether that's very technical or not is up to the designer. But I feel, you know, maybe both approaches, of course, they're totally valid. You can go from a very utilitarian, what's that word? Like a practical way of looking at things. It's a tool and you press this button and then this happens and then the job is done, which is, you know, absolutely valid. But then there's also the matter of like, how does it feel? And I think the immediacy of touching an object and playing it, how it feels is extremely important. And even the smell, you know, or what it makes you feel, like you're becoming part of something as you interact with it and express yourself through something that makes you feel a certain way or resonates with you in a more maybe ambiguous way than just the utility of the device or the object. And I also think the same with like software design. Good software design does not have all the options or possibilities laid out for you. It's kind of like a curated array of parameters that are available to the user to interact with, that kind of make it more streamlined and easier to use and more immediate than, you know, maybe a feature creature where you can do anything and you're just totally flustered because you don't even know where to start or begin. So if I would see a synthesizer with 1,000 knobs, I'm not crazy excited about it. But if I see something with no knobs, I'm much more intrigued. Yeah, which is probably why there's no knob on my instrument. But like, you know, I think both approaches are very important, and maybe the marriage of the two, the utility versus the how it feels, because we are dealing with art and creativity and not, you know, the James Webb telescope. Yeah, but both aspects are important.
If I can add a sentiment to this, I'm going to keep ganging up on Áki and say that to call instruments practical tools only is like saying sex is only about procreation. But I think I also agree with Áki's sentiment that I think the joy of creating instruments is something that should be absolutely democratic and as widely available as possible. And I think there is a risk to making very pretty objects like these and putting them on pedestals as we've done today. Could potentially tell somebody that like, hey, this is too difficult, don't do it. Which your project doesn't do, which is helps in the other direction. And
where are my instruments?
Yeah, where are your instruments? Lost to history. But I also have a sense that we have talked a little bit about the historical condition of the symphony orchestra, which at the time was an amazing technological innovation. It was the best probably art experience you could have in Central Europe, 200-300 years ago. Blew your mind and you never wanted to do anything else except sit in the concert hall. Now we have different technologies, so its role has changed, and maybe it has to invent new ways to stay relevant. And I think groups of large musicians coming together and having fun should definitely still be a thing we do as a culture. But maybe the standardization of the instruments is not as necessary, and I feel an interest, aside from my own practice, that I think people are into creating intimate tools that are maybe quite specific, maybe only one individual that they use for their music making or share with their friends or something like that. So I have a sneaky suspicion that at least in this kind of wealthy part of the world in the next whatever decades, we will see music makers creating their own music making systems. And like somebody said earlier, creating a voice, I think it was my namesake, Halldór Úlfarsson, that maybe as you create your identity as a creative, creating your own musical tools will become like one way to do that. Or then hopefully also just for personal fun or fun with your friends or something like that.
If I can just add on one thing that you said that I think is one of the most beautiful parts about actually creating physical instruments is the multisensory experience, because I kind of see the strong contrast between two of my works. One that is strongly digital, and of course there is always the mapping to the bodily gestures, and they kind of create this kind of more intimate connection with the sound, which is very natural, which is very intuitive. But still, there are other elements, like when it comes to the touch, when it comes to the smell, that I don't really get to experience with those instruments. And I think making these physical instruments, it can be sometimes almost like, I know this is very sentimental, and very, very kind of sentimental way of thinking about it, but it is such a strong part of the experience when you can smell it, when you can even taste it, especially with wind instruments. You can taste, how old it is, and what it's been through, and yeah, it's far more than just about our hearing, and it's also about the touch, about the, haptic feedback that we get from it, that we get through the vibrations, and I think that's very powerful, and we should definitely think about all of our senses and how we can enhance this multisensory experience with design of new instruments. So. Yeah, I found it very beautiful, what you said, so just wanted to jump.
Michael, yeah. From what Halldór said regarding making an instrument as your own voice and making it just for a small group of people or your own use case, where do you see the border between making an instrument and patching a modular synthesizer where you chose the modules yourself and the way you arrange them, the way you patch them together, or do the same digitally? I mean, there's already a really big community doing that, and it's, like you said, it's very much growing and becoming more and more common. Do you already consider that making your own?
Yeah, I don't see a big difference between that and what I think will be maybe more specific around being able to make your own organized material interfaces. I think there's definitely that culture goes a far way to what I'm referring to.
Also, I think in electronic music, the line between composing and creating an instrument is very blurred. So many people have made systems that generate music or instruments that kind of only are a one-trick pony, but they generate a certain piece of music, so creating that instrument was an integral part of the musical composition. So that's also in electronic music, I think, a very blurred line. Yeah, between the two.
And I also think that actually thinking about the virtual instruments, digital musical instruments as composition can be actually super helpful, because I think otherwise we can very easily get stuck in the editing process where, you know, like the instrument is in constant flux, which, yeah, can be a nice part of it, but it never really feels like something that is repeatable. So actually kind of taking on the concept of like, okay, I'm designing this instrument as a composition. So at this point, this instrument is finished. I think, at least to me personally, it helps a lot because I can think about it more conceptually, rather than as, you know, just something that never really is finished.
Yeah, I think it's also about designing the constraints you want the instrument or the composition to have. For instance, when you patch in Maxer with many notes on a synth, you have a world of possibility that's opening up, and you could go on adding more and more and never have a composition, because that's mostly about creating the constraint where there's going to be that specific flow of events or for sound or for ideas that you were thinking of. Yeah.
I might also add, like in my own experience, like the most interesting sounds that I have captured have never been from completed instruments. They've always been from prototypes that are barely functioning, maybe only work for half an hour until they fizzle out in smoke. And you know, that's also like this thing of immediacy, like something that is not repeatable, not reliable, not commercially viable, or something that is more like just improvising with a friend. It's a moment and it's interesting, and you will never ever experience it again. So there's also that in instrument making that is such a big part of the joy that Áki talks about. It's just like this nest of wires that you don't even understand what's going on, but it's very intriguing.
I have been one of Áki's victims in this experimentation, so I can say that the fun is often one-sided.
I'm sorry.
Það var bara einu sinni sem að ég var að spila á þig. He performed very well. He's a very good victim.
Okay, I guess that with this funny notes, we can wrap up. It was like beautiful experience for me. Was like the description and the practices of all you are very, very different and variegated, and this enriched a lot the conversation. So thank you everybody for participating, and thanks to the panelists. It was a great, great conversation.